The honourable member for Sackville-Cobequid.
Speaker, I rise to address the issue of school violence. The epidemic levels of violence demand an epidemic response from this government, including devoting the fiscal resources to staff schools appropriately, providing training to staff and education to students, supply resources to families, and normalize occupational health and safety protocols and practices in Nova Scotia's public schools. Not only does this budget contain no substantive investments to address these critical needs, this government appears to believe that launching an updated policy is the magic wand that will make school violence disappear. Speaker, to be plain, the government's response to an issue this large with harms this widespread and profound cannot be limited to a policy rework and launch. Yesterday in question period, based on the Safe Staff, Safe Schools report prepared by CUPE Nova Scotia on behalf of over 5,000 school support staff, I drew attention to the stark reality of how commonplace violence is in our schools. School staff at large report witnessing or experiencing violence in their workplace at least once a week. Looking at this data through the eyes of teaching assistants, that frequency leaps alarmingly to 52% of teaching assistants who witness or experience violence on a daily basis. Yesterday, I asked the Minister of Education and Early Childhood Development if he would confirm that the currently under development Provincial Code of Conduct for Students would fully implement the recommendations of the Auditor General's landmark 2024 report on school violence as a key step to enhanced accountability. Despite the minister's flowery response that school support staff can trust his government and its actions on their behalf, he offered no such confirmation. Further, the minister's comments reiterated the oft-repeated public stance of this government that the answer to the epidemic of school violence captured in the Auditor General's report is to implement an updated code of conduct by March of 2025. I want to be clear, not only as the official opposition's critic on public education, but also as a classroom teacher in Nova Scotia's classrooms since 2002, and the parent of 2 students that continue to learn in publicly funded public schools in this province, that I agree that an effective code of conduct has been missing in action for a very long time. It is encouraging to see this government moving to rework this policy as a component of addressing school violence. It's both long overdue and a valuable starting point. That said, policy alone always has been and always will be insufficient to address the issues that are systemic in nature. One of the challenges of developing good policy is that it often leaves out voices and perspectives that provide one-of-a-kind insight on what issues look and feel like, and ideas about how they can be addressed constructively, proactively, and effectively. Those on the ground in classrooms know that the government's recently announced cell phone policy was successful largely because of the wide inclusive scope of consultation that engaged frontline staff working in diverse roles. Given the success of engaging with frontline staff on policy development about cell phones, one would assume this government would follow a similar blueprint to inform the redevelopment of the student of conduct. Speaker, it strains all reason to report that this is not the case. Yesterday, despite his promises to school support staff, the minister failed to admit that the leadership of the unions representing school support staff have never been invited to provide input on school violence as part of redeveloping the code of conduct he promised would arrive in mere weeks. Speaker, I can tell you these leaders have made written requests to the minister to be able to share this input. Unless the minister has late-breaking plans we don't know about, this means the perspective of 5,000 school support staff has gone utterly disregarded throughout the update of this policy, despite its material interest to school support staff because of its impact on their working conditions and bodily and psychological safety every day they report to work. There are other glaring omissions in the minister's consultation process. Several organizations that advocate for systemic change to address the epidemic of gender-based violence in this province, such as Be the Peace Institute, a nonpartisan advocacy group pursuing solutions to gender-based violence through trauma-informed, culturally responsive approaches, have made written requests to the minister to present their input on a code of conduct that responds to gender-based and sexual violence in age-appropriate ways at all grade levels in public schools. As of the delivery of these remarks, the minister has neither responded to these requests nor granted them. While this House has heard this government's acknowledgement of gender-based violence as an epidemic, its non-response to advocates seeking to inform an updated code of conduct so that it meaningfully incorporates trauma-informed responses to gender-based and sexual violence in schools belies an inexcusable ambivalence as the number of Nova Scotian lives lost to this altogether preventable scourge grows by the month. Speaker, a rework of a policy as important as the school code of conduct demands that this government seek out and consider every perspective on violence. Sadly, the process it has followed to date falls gravely short of that mark. Speaker, school violence is a profoundly complex issue. Weapons arrive in Nova Scotia schools daily. The school I taught in experienced the brutal stabbing of 2 staff whose wounds were life-threatening and remain life-altering. Students raised in homes where violence and trauma are ingrained in everyday life means they exist in never-ending states of fight or flight. They carry this trauma into their classrooms, and for them, lashing out isn't about malice. It speaks to being locked in a fight just to live. The reality of inclusive education in Nova Scotia is that students with complex developmental needs inexcusably go without the direct support from teaching assistants and other support staff mandated by their individual program plans because inclusive education has never been properly funded in Nova Scotia. Staffing shortages in our schools mean learning center and resource teachers and school support staff are daily pulled from the delivery of inclusive education supports to cover classes because there just aren't enough bodies to make schools work. The students most affected by these realities can and do express their loss and frustration in physical ways that result in physical harm to peers and staff close enough to reach. The epidemic of youth mental health in every corner of this province means youth that can't access care or resources concentrated in Metro arrive at schools in heightened states of distress and despair. Many of these youth harm themselves or peers and staff when they can no longer bear up under the weight of their legitimate yet unsupported mental illnesses. Speaker, I don't have to tell anyone in this House that we live in times where hate is on the rise. Schools are a microcosm of our society at large and are not immune to the radicalization that has emboldened white supremacy, anti-Black, anti-Asian, anti-Indigenous racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, misogyny, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, and myriad other forms of hate. There is no question that violence in schools is an echo of the violence of hate we witness with frightening regularity in broader society. Speaker, these remarks only begin to scratch the surface of the realities of school violence in our province. Without any update on the consultation process, it's unclear whether this government has taken the time to conceptualize violence in schools, taking into account that it is intersectional, complex, and systemic in nature. I say again that an updated code of conduct is a worthy and necessary venture, and the official opposition stands fully prepared to support the robust consultation necessary to ensure this policy takes fully into account the complexity of the issue and supports a plurality of response that addresses its root causes for students, staff, schools, and communities. That said, Speaker, while an updated code of conduct is long overdue, and an important foundation from which to address school violence, a policy alone is insufficient to address its root causes. This budget falls short in addressing school violence because it does not fund the development and implementation of a comprehensive strategy. It fails to fund an accessible, reliable reporting mechanism which is sorely needed to capture an accurate portrait of a systemic issue that allows decisions to be made with sound, relevant data. It fails to fund necessary training for school staff and education for students on the issue of violence. It fails to fund education entities to properly action and adhere to occupational health and safety legislation and protocols at every school site. This budget lets families down by failing to fund resources for them to support their children to be peaceful, respectful, and inclusive citizens and students. Speaker, an updated code of conduct is a needed step, one we applaud, but this budget demonstrates that all the government's eggs to address school violence are in one policy basket when it comes to addressing this epidemic, rather than approaching this epidemic with the vision and funding necessary to address it at its root. Thank you, Speaker.